Chapter 9. Madeleine Thibault was beyond gorgeous. The kind of woman that made Camille shrink into a cocoon of doubt and insecurity in the shadows of her basking beauty. But the look in her eyes, heartbroken devastation, had the opposite effect over Camille. It was clear Madeleine was far more envious of her than Camille could ever feel in return. Still, the two could end up having far more in common than either imagined. But right now, Camille was on top, and she had to be the bigger person. She sucked it up and stepped toward Madeleine, extending her hand. "Hello, I'm Camille Chandler." "De Laurent. Camille Chandler de Laurent," Julian corrected her. Madeleine's face tightened. If Julian meant to discourage her, he was succeeding. Her cold hand gripped Camille's with the effectiveness of a wet noodle. "Madeleine Thibault," she said, her voice cracking around her Queen's English accent. "Have you had breakfast?" Camille gestured at the table. "Would you like to join us?" Madeleine's sad smile looked bereft and bleak. "Yes." She surveyed the table and moved toward the buffet table. "I think I might." Julian, who moments before was excusing himself, sat back down. Camille eased into her chair, her spirits sinking to the floor. She was just about ready to throw a pity party for her competition. Madeleine approached the table and snagged the empty seat between André and Lacey. She avoided looking at Julian. Who could blame her? "So, Madeleine." Camille was not going to be the mean-spirited so-called winner. Far as she could see, there were no winners, not where Julian de Laurent was concerned. "Have you lived in Marseille all your life?" "No, I was born in Paris." Madeleine's words came slowly and reluctantly, like she didn't trust Camille's sincerity. "I spent much of my school years in England." That explained the British accent. "It wasn't until I'd met Julien in Nice a few years back that I began spending time in Marseille. I have a small apartment there." Madeleine held her head high, keeping her pride intact. So why was she here? Why wasn't she at her small apartment in Marseille? But who was Camille to question the de Laurent family? She'd just have to make the best of an awkward situation. She made a mental note. When the time came to get married for real, she'd discourage an invasion of her bridegroom's old flings. But this wasn't real. She couldn't forget that. "I envy you," Camille admitted. "Envy me? Whatever for?" Madeleine doused her with an annoying glare, as if she thought she was being mocked. "You're so traveled." Camille remained calm. "I envy your first-hand experience of having visited so many places. I doubt that'll last long." Madeleine's wall of dignity began to crumble. She avoided any further eye contact with both Camille and Julian. Instead, she focused on Claudette. "Maurice said you were going shopping today. Might I perhaps tag along?" Claudette's attention darted around the table and settled on Julian. "To tell the truth, Madeleine, Lacey and I are taking Camille into town to settle wedding arrangements." "Ah." Madeleine's voice tapered off. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I guess nobody wants me to tag along for that." "Why would you want to?" Camille didn't have the guts to say that out loud, but it didn't stop her curiosity. Why would anybody want to stick around and watch somebody they loved get hitched to someone else? Camille would be on the first plane, train, bus, or whatever. "If Madeleine wants to go shopping with us," Camille said to no one in particular, "I have no objections." Julian cleared his throat and rose from the table. "I'm sure you ladies will work it out. I must be going." He glanced at Camille and stretched out his hand. Walk me out." Long, extended fingers drew her like a magnet. Their touch bathed her in an appealing gentleness. She hurried after Julian as he rushed into the hallway like a speed walker. "What's going on?" Camille whispered. "Is she for real?" Julian stopped just outside the door. "Madeleine Thibault has never been that considerate in her whole life." "Well, she is heartbroken," Camille reminded him. "Thanks to you."
"Heartbroken?"
His abruptness shook Camille, awakening her senses.
"She's up to something. You be careful."
Budding fear swept through Camille. "Once again, I don't have to be worried about my physical safety, do I?"
"Madeleine's not the physical kind."
Julian dashed down the stairs.
"She's more devious,"
he said, with Camille following him.
"More backstabbing than that. She's more apt to discredit you, make you appear unworthy, incapable of fulfilling the position my wife would assume in European society."
Jeez, he made being his wife sound so hard. What had she gotten herself into? At the front door, Julian brushed his lips against her cheek, and Camille forgot all about her insecurities.
"Remember,"
his tone held a mixture of order and suggestion,
"if the excursion gets to be too overwhelming, just call Soren, and he'll bring you back to the house."
"Where are you going?" She wasn't being nosy, just curious.
"I have an empire to run."
He opened the door and headed outside. "I thought that was your father's job."
"He leads the family. I run the business."
"Oh." Her response flittered off her tongue. His revelation surprised Camille, maybe even impressed her a little. He moved toward the car and Sebastian opened the door. Julian stopped and glanced over his shoulder.
"I'll be back around 6,
he said, before disappearing into the limo. 6? Didn't he say something about 4 at breakfast? Camille had a lot to learn about the interworkings of a multi-billion-dollar family and its very enigmatic, but oh, so sexy, second-in-command. Clouds sprinkled the morning sky like wisps of cotton balls. She was getting married in a couple of days. Was this a bad sign? Hell no. There aren't any signs, good or bad, for arranged marriages. The car drove away and Andre appeared from inside the house, as if he'd been waiting for Julian to leave. He looked at her and smiled, slipping his hands inside his pockets.
"Camille, is it all right if I call you Camille?"
he asked, a little too friendly-like. "Yes." She hesitated, unsure of his motives, and erected a sober reserve. "Do you work with Julian? He's left already."
"I work for Julian, and we rarely ride in together. He's always got me off running errands."
His tone was free of animosity. Not only did Andre appear to know his place, he seemed content with the position. "And you like that just fine," she realized out loud.
"Hell yes."
He grinned, openly amused.
"He's always stuck inside the office, making business deals and whatnot."
Andre's tone illustrated his distaste for his brother's post. "I, on the other hand, am always off globe-trotting, visiting new and exciting places, wining and dining clients and friends," he said with a wink.
"He can keep his job. I like mine just fine."
"Well, then." A covetous feeling of contentment swept over Camille. "I envy you. To love what you do for a living is a godsend, a luxury not many people can afford."
"Speaking of my job," he chuckled, "it's my job to retrieve your friend in America. You might want to contact her. I'll send a car for her."
"She can meet you at the airport."
"I wouldn't hear of it."
What a gentlemanly thing to say. It reminded her of Julian, always thinking of someone else's comfort and ease. Maurice and Claudette had taught them well the art of courteous behavior. "It's no trouble at all." Camille raised her tone with insistence. There's no need for you to go traipsing all over L.A. just to bring Tasha to the airport." Andre's laughter cascaded across the wind whipping past. "Ah, yes, Americans. So independent." She glanced at him through narrowed eyes and then looked away. "Which airport?" Andre studied her with raised eyebrows. "Which airport do you want her to meet you?"
"Which is more convenient for her?"
"Let's ask her." Camille pulled out her cell phone and began texting Tasha. Within seconds, she had an answer. LAX. Where to meet? Camille showed Andre the cell phone screen and waited for his response. Andre snatched up her phone and began pressing buttons. When he was done, a satisfied look warmed his face, and he returned the device to Camille. She studied the phone a moment, half curious to know what he had texted to Tasha.
"Oh!"
Andre smacked her arm lightly with the back of his hand.
"Tell her to send a photo,"
he said, a flicker of amusement lighting his face. Camille's phone chimed. "Hang on." She raised a finger at Andre and took the call. "Yeah?"
"Sherry?"
Julian's voice, anxious yet comforting, poured over the phone.
"Has Andre talked to you about bringing your friend over?"
"As a matter of fact, we're just discussing that right now." She glanced at Andre. "He wants her to text him a photograph so he can recognize her at the airport, I suppose."
"Let me speak with my brother, please."
Julian's tone, short and to the point, reached across the airwaves and wrapped Camille in an icy chill. She shoved the phone at Julian's brother. "He wants to talk to you." Andre drew a heavy breath and rolled his eyes before laying the phone against his ear. Even so, she still heard Julian's higher-pitched voice, loud and clear.
"No, Andre, there will be no pictures of Camille's friend. You're not going to get her for your own amusement, so get that out of your head."
Hope fell from Andre's face as he listened to Julian's orders.
"Just bring her here and be on your best behavior."
Andre disconnected the call and handed the phone to Camille.
"Spoil sport."
"He's your brother."
"And your husband. I had no choice in the matter."
An easy smile played at the corners of Andre's mouth.
"You, on the other hand, could have and should have run far, far away."
He nodded and slipped into the back seat of the car. "Oh, I know I should run." But Camille didn't have the desire. She laced her fingers together behind her back and waited until Andre's car disappeared down the long, winding driveway. Hands still clasped behind her, Camille was ready to return to the house when another limo rolled up in front of the house. As if right on cue, Claudette, Lacey, and Madeleine exited the house. The three women looked like an expensive fashion ad for Europe's finest designers. She glanced down at her own attire, a casual ensemble of white capri pants and a matching print blouse. Camille's clothes cost more than 2 weeks her normal pay, and she felt ill-qualified to wear them. She didn't do the outfit justice, especially up against her companions in their trendy styles.
"Are we ready?"
Claudette asked, not giving the same attention Camille had to her attire. "Sure, why not?" Camille shrugged her misgivings aside and climbed into the limo. The morning passed quickly as a high-profile wedding planner led them around the city, stopping at places like the florist and the caterers. Claudette was more than willing to weigh in on every aspect, but ultimately and respectfully left the final decision to Camille. Lacey gave no arguments to anyone. Loving everything, she only looked for the romance. Madeleine remained quiet but observant. At lunchtime, they stopped at a sidewalk cafe and dined on a buffet. Lacey had excused herself and gone to the restroom. Claudette had gone back for seconds, saying,
"I try to watch my figure, but 1 or 2 meals a week, I just let loose."
Camille watched her sashaying away, contemplating Claudette's age. She had to be at least 45. Damn, she carried it well. "Camille." Madeleine drew her attention away from Claudette and back to the awkwardness of the situation. "May I call you Camille?" "Sure." What else would she call her?
I hope that despite the circumstances, you and I can remain civil to one another.
I don't see why we can't, Madeleine.
Well, that's very big of you.
The kind words were there, but so was the nettling insolence.
Most wives aren't so accommodating.
Accommodating? Camille wasn't quite sure what Madeleine was insinuating, and she wanted clarification.
Well,
she looked away scandalously, then back at Camille.
He's put you by his side, but did he tell you about his plans to keep me on the side?
Camille tried to keep her jaw from falling and failed.
I don't even know what to say to that. I can understand your reaction,
Madeleine said, as if they were discussing a business deal.
A month ago I thought I might fill your shoes, but then I find out Julien's been swept off his feet by some bitch in America. Pardon my English.
She smirked, shrugged, and perched her hands in the air.
And now I'm relegated to mistress. Guess I have a lot to learn about French culture.
She paused and nodded absently.
Where I come from, we call that a demotion.
Camille displayed a picture of calmness for Madeleine's benefit, but she didn't understand Julien's reasoning and didn't like the idea that he wouldn't marry the girl, but he'd continue to sleep with her after he married someone else, even if it was just a business deal. Julien scoured the house, looking for Camille, overwhelmed by his desire to hear the details of the shopping trip. He didn't trust Madeleine, mainly because he didn't trust his father to mind his own business. If Papa had his way, there'd be no telling what kind of corruption he'd hold over Madeleine. After having no luck inside the house, he headed for the gardens. He didn't know Camille well enough to guess which direction she'd gone, so he took it methodically. The scent from the roses called to him. Maybe it had done the same with Camille. The women in his life, first his mother and then Claudette and Lacey, were mesmerized by the fragrant flowers. Between the two mother figures, he had learned the meanings of all their colors at an early age. In the garden, he snipped a lavender bloom, because he had been enchanted with her at first sight, and a blue bud, because he figured she was pretty much unattainable, just like his mother had been. His mother. Was that where she had gone? The place his mother used to bring Julien and Andre to play. The grove seemed to be one of the few areas left to look, even though Camille's finding it made no sense. He turned sideways and squeezed into the shrubs, scraping his shirt as he reached the clearing, a place he hadn't been in over 15 years. It looked the same, weathered with time but not necessarily neglected. 4 windswept benches were centered on each side of the perimeter. 4 shrubs and the lawn they cornered were manicured, and various vines had spread across the trees behind the hedged borders. To see her sitting on the bench, much like his mother used to do with her legs crossed at the ankles, warmed his heart. He cleared his throat and moved toward Camille. Her gaze traveled up and met his, accompanied by a warm smile. "How did you find this place?" he asked, taking a seat and leaving plenty of breathing room between them. Julien didn't want to invade her space without an invitation. Anybody who'd search out this place was definitely after seclusion.
"Just my wandering curiosity, I guess."
She shrugged and draped her arms along the back of the bench, her hand nearly touching his shoulder. Camille had learned to conceal her pain, the hurt carved into her heart over being abandoned by her parents. But here in the late afternoon sunset, her face, well-modeled and feminine, gave away her secret. Sadness twisted into a painful knot inside Julien. A take-charge man, he was used to getting his way, and he wanted to remove her pain, but didn't know how. His inadequacy hammered at him, made him feel helpless. "It's funny that you should seek out and find this one place over all others."
"Why's that?"
"Andre and I used to play here as children."
"Really?"
She gave him one of those looks that said, "You're kidding, right?"
"It's the truth."
He nodded, his thoughts wandering off toward his childhood memories.
"My mother, my real mother, showed me this place."
He'd opened a door that had been locked for over 20 years, immediately assaulted by an acute sense of loss. As if sensing his grief and despair, she removed her arms from the back of the bench and laced her hands together in her lap.
"What happened to your mother?"
she asked, encasing her words in a careful tone. Julian leaned forward and rested his elbows on his thighs and absently caressed the soft petals of the roses in his hands.
He
stopped. Talking about his mother was hard. Mentioning it meant he'd have to acknowledge the flaw that had consumed her sanity. Weakness. And what if Camille thought that had somehow rubbed off on him? What if she assumed it meant he was also weak? Did it really matter what she thought? Last week he was sure the only thing that mattered was his wife staying put for the agreed time. After that, he didn't care what happened. But that was last week. Now, he wasn't so sure.
"She killed herself,"
Julian continued on, hoping Camille's presence would continue to bring him peace.
"With a bottle of pills."
He hated the helplessness piling around him.
"I was 5, but I'll never forget walking into her room and seeing her lying there on the bed."
He looked away, the words snagging in his throat.
"I thought she was sleeping."
Camille closed the gap between them and drew him into her arms.
"Oh, Julian, I'm so sorry."
Instinct, and maybe need, pushed Julian to embrace Camille and hang on as if she'd float away otherwise. A rush of vulnerability swarmed around Julian, and he pulled away. "Okay, we can stop this now." He handed her the roses, hoping that would sway her in another direction.
"Here, these are for you."
She took the flowers and draped her arms around him again. Julian wished she wouldn't do that. He didn't like how good it felt, but he didn't try to stop it either. Instead, he welcomed her comforting embrace, even if it did mean he was losing his touch. Camille didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, did nothing but hold on to the magnificent man in her arms. She didn't want to acknowledge the magnetism building between them, but she had no choice. It was there, dominating her mind, body, and soul. Julian pulled away, and her heart reacted like it had been electrocuted. She swallowed hard, trying to devour the lump lingering in her throat.
"How was your shopping trip?"
he said smoothly, stoic-faced. The memory of her conversation with Madeleine shuddered through Camille. Your Madeleine is something else."
"My Madeleine? She's not my Madeleine."
"She thinks she is." Jealousy snuck up against Camille, and she tried to divert the unwanted sensation.
"Is that so?"
He smiled, like he saw right through her. "She told me that I may be marrying you, but she's going to be sleeping with you on the side."
"She said those exact words?"
Camille couldn't tell if he was astonished or pleased to know he'd have a warm body waiting any time he wanted. "Precisely," she said.
"Huh. Wow."
He tempered his shock with amusement.
"Papa's really pulling out all the stops to run you off."
"Then I guess the joke's on them." A sensation of tired sadness passed over Camille. "Considering our arrangement, it's really none of my business who you sleep with." A hint of regret clouded his eyes for just a second, and then it was gone.
"But that's our secret,"
he said, and winked. "Yes, it is." She forced herself to look at Julian. I'll be discreet if you are, she bargained in a teasing manner, the only way she knew to hide the reality of her discomfort.
Really?
He said, half intrigued, half put out.
And just who is on our radar?
She stood and sashayed toward the shrubbery maze. Wouldn't you like to know? She giggled and ran inside. Julian followed her.
You're serious, aren't you?
He asked, as if he had been snubbed.
There's someone you want to sleep with?
He stopped her and backed her against the wall of shrubs. They stood inches apart, Julian staring at Camille, her gaze glued to his, their breaths increasing, mixing, intermingling. He looked her over seductively. It left a tingling in the pit of her stomach that riveted out to her fingertips and toes, allowing her to break the visual connection. I should go inside. She slipped to the side and put some space between them. It's getting chilly out here. Stepping away, she let her fears quicken her steps toward the hidden passage in the hedge. Camille's heartbeat amplified and coursed desire through her like an awakened river. Her head screamed no. Falling for Julian wasn't smart. Her new husband intended to remain the bachelor about town, and no marriage would alter that, least of all theirs. But her heart had already said yes. Chapter 10. By the time Andre returned with Tasha, preparations for the wedding were well underway. The flowers had arrived. The rented chairs, tables, and tents had been delivered, and now a crew of hired workers were setting the scene for the reception behind the rose garden. Claudette and Camille had agreed it was the perfect place, with a spacious area amid the roses for a makeshift dance floor. Of course, it was also the location of Claudette and Maurice's wedding reception 20 years ago. When the car arrived, bringing Andre and Tasha from the airport, Camille had been gazing out the west dining room's wall of windows. She raced through the hall and down the stairs, stopping halfway when her best friend entered the house and paused just inside the entryway. Thank God. Camille no longer felt alone. Tasha! Camille trotted down the stairs and embraced Tasha as she reached the bottom step.
Here she is, Andre said with a grand gesture. Safe and sound.
Yes, your new brother-in-law took a personal interest in my well-being. She smiled at Andre and winked. The gushing was almost sickening. Julian barged in from an opposite hallway.
Where have you been?
He asked Andre in particular, offering no smiles, no welcome home, no thanks for the favor.
Tasha and I stopped over in London.
Andre's flat tone offered no indication that an explanation was forthcoming. Camille supposed it was his way of standing up to Big Brother. Julian was silent for a moment. His frustration worked his bottom jaw, and after a bit he made a conscious effort to stop.
Did you stop in Paris?
He remained focused on Andre.
Yes, Big Brother, we did.
Andre winked at Tasha.
Marie promised the dresses will all be delivered this afternoon, a full 2 hours before the ceremony.
2 hours? Aren't we pushing it a little? Tasha asked in a comical tone. Boy, I'll say. If this wedding was real, Camille would be nearing the breaking point.
Well, we had to move up the wedding day.
Julian smirked.
We think Camille is pregnant,
Julian added, his tone drenched in sarcasm. Camille smacked him. He rolled his eyes and let them settle on Camille, his expression softening.
Why don't you get your friend settled in, and then you can show her around? There's nothing much for you to do at this stage.
You want me to show her around? Camille said in a casual, jesting way. Who's going to come find us when I get lost? Andre raised his hand.
I can do that.
Tasha looked at him like he was a white knight. Everybody loves a hero. Julian huffed and took a couple of steps away before turning back to Camille.
Cherie, I've got some things to attend to, but I'll be back in plenty of time before the ceremony.
Camille considered just what business he could have, but decided not to ask. Maybe he was going to pay Madeleine a visit, as most bridegrooms expected certain things to happen on their wedding day. Maybe Julian was arranging his wedding night bliss. It just wouldn't be with his bride. There was a little something unsettling about that notion, even though Camille knew precisely where she stood with Julian. She didn't need to be reminded that they were in a business arrangement. Assuming it could turn into anything more wasn't smart, and she'd just be setting herself up for heartbreak. "Come on." Camille grabbed Tasha's hand. "Come with me. There's an empty bedroom right beside mine." "Like you're going to be in there," Tasha laughed as Camille pulled her up the stairs. "Thanks for the ride, Andre," she said, without looking over her shoulder.
"My pleasure, Cherie," he called out. "Remember, if you need anything at all, I'm your man."
Camille stopped Tasha at the top of the landing. "Look," she pointed an accusatory finger at Tasha. "Andre is not your play toy, okay?" It was no question. "How about my boy toy?" She snickered. "Can he be my boy toy?" "Tasha." Camille issued her best warning tone in hopes of stifling Tasha's amusement. "This is not funny. Lighten up." She eyed Camille with one suspiciously perched eyebrow. "God, you're so uptight. Jeez, isn't that scrumptious man of yours taking care of you?" She breathed in a shallow, quick gasp. "Oh, don't tell me this family is that old-fashioned." She sighed, disappointed. Clearly, she'd set her sights on bagging Andre while she was here, and she thought family principles might spoil her chances. Maybe it was best to let her think that. Then maybe she'd leave Andre alone. You can't argue with tradition. Monique's silent footsteps went unheard until she was standing at Camille's side. She paused silently until she was acknowledged. "Mademoiselle Camille, you're needed in the downstairs library," she said softly. "Madame de Laurent needs your approval on some last-minute arrangements." Camille sighed and bit her tongue, the urge to swear growing. "All right," she said to the maid, and turned to Tasha. "Just go ahead and get settled in. I'll be back in a few." "Well, don't leave me stranded here too long." Tasha's words chased her down the hallway. "I'll never find my way out of this place." Leave it to Tasha to infuse a little humor into this zany situation. Camille snickered and hurried down the stairs. Knowing Claudette, her dilemma was probably nothing more than where to place the orchids in relation to the roses. Not that Claudette was superficial. She and Camille just lived in very different worlds. Some time later, when Camille had finally garnered a spare moment away from the hustle and bustle of planning an impromptu wedding, she headed for Tasha's room, only to find it empty. Where was that girl? Hopefully she hadn't found Andre's room. Camille glanced up and down the hallway. Searching for Tasha meant she'd run the risk of running into Maurice, or worse yet, Madeleine. The last thing she needed right now was hearing Madeleine bragging about satisfying Julian on his wedding day to Camille. She opted for her room across the hall instead, with thoughts on taking a nice hot shower. The shower was refreshing, but Camille was still left with a sense of unease. After the terry-cloth robe had drained the excess moisture from her body, she slipped out of it and into the silk robe Julian had given her. She liked the feel of the smooth fabric against her bare skin. She was getting married this evening, but she couldn't help feeling something was going to go wrong. The owner of the finest salon in Paris had been flown in to doll up the wedding party. Jean-Jean was attractive and hip and definitely not gay. He had flirted relentlessly with Tasha the whole time he worked on her hair. He had agreed to style Claudette, Lacey, Tasha, and Camille's hair, saving the bride for last. He'd brought along an assistant to tend to everyone else. Camille wanted to ignore the dark clouds rolling across the sky, but Jean-Jean had turned her toward the window to keep her from watching him in the mirror as he styled her hair. She was faced with letting that nagging feeling that her wedding, as fake as it was going to get rained out consume her. "Are you sure?" she asked Jean-Jean of his suggestion, more like insistence, that he style her hair up off her shoulders. "Leave it to me," he said. "I am the beauty expert." Yeah, well, that's debatable. But that was just her own insecurities talking. Actually, Jean-Jean was the epitome of style. His high-end designer jeans and T-shirt underneath a leather vest, offset by those snakeskin boots, was the embodiment of cool. But still, a look Camille would never shoot for. She was much too conservative, or as Tasha would say, drab. Tasha meant well. There was no maliciousness in her at all, not where Camille was concerned. Tasha had often tried to color Camille up, but she just wasn't interested. "If I don't like it," Camille told Jean-Jean of her hair, "I'm going to take it down." "Oh, no." He paused, perched a hand on his hip. "You must not deface a creation by Jean-Jean." He used his comb as a pointer, admonishing Camille. She didn't take her overbearing hairdresser seriously. He was overshadowed by the clouds outside as they thickened and darkened. The door opened. No knock, no request to enter. From a diffused reflection in the window, Camille saw Tasha storm in, wearing a mid-thigh-length robe. "What is up with that Madeline chick?" She dropped onto the bed and eyed the red silk robe Camille was wearing. Jean-Jean snorted, but continued to work on Camille's hair. Camille groaned, wanting to look at her hair, but Jean-Jean refused. "What's her deal?" Tasha said again. "She's awfully pissed about something." She toed out of her slippers and lay down on her side, propping her bare feet on the bed. "She's not the bride." A smart-alecky tone escaped Camille. Jean-Jean laughed. "Seriously?" Tasha sat up and dangled her feet off the side of the bed. "She's Julian's ex?" "Well, according to her, she's not an ex." "In her dreams," Jean-Jean said. "She's never been anything more than a booty call." "According to her and Maurice," Camille said, "she's just what Julian needs." "Yeah, maybe if he's hard up," Jean-Jean snickered. All three laughed. "Man, I need to steer clear of her," Tasha stated. "Well, good luck with that one," Jean-Jean said. "She's finagled her way into indefinite guest status here." "Boy, I tell you," Tasha shook her head. "I just don't understand French customs." "Oh, honey, it's not a French thing," he said, waving his comb in the air. "It's a beach thing." "That's true," Camille agreed, recalling their lunch date. "She leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to tact. So, how many of Julian's ex-girlfriends are coming to the wedding?" Tasha's dramatic flair centered in her contemptuous laughter. Only Camille. This could only happen to her. Who else would end up in a beautiful chateau in France, about to marry a billionaire, one that wasn't too hard on the eyes, but only as a business arrangement, and with his concubine staying in the same house with them? Any minute now, she'd awaken. Jean-Jean giggled. "I like you," he said to Tasha. "You can stay." "Cool." She turned to him. "So, where do you hide all the hot French guys?" "Oh, we keep them in during the day." His friendly bantering came across in a relaxed manner. "Ooh, they come out at night?" Tasha pressed her fingertips to her lips. Whatever. So long as Tasha left Andre alone, that's all Camille cared about. She didn't want to spend the next 6 months listening to Julian bitching about how Tasha broke Andre's heart. Camille stared out the window at the unfolding scene on the lawn. The guests were starting to arrive, and she still didn't have a dress. It should have been delivered an hour ago. She glanced at the sky, thick and heavy with some of the blackest clouds she'd ever seen. Great. If she was the suspicious kind, and she was getting married for real, she'd say the day's uneasy events were starting to look like a sign. She went to Julian's door and knocked. "Come in." Madeleine's voice, velvet-edged and sickeningly sweet, filtered through the walls. Could this day get any worse? Camille plastered on the face of indifference as she opened the door. Seeing Madeleine sprawled out on Julian's bed was enough to push even the sanest of women over the edge. She drew in a breath and forbade the claws to emerge. "Where is Julian?" Camille asked, staying in the entryway and hanging onto the doorknob. "Shower." Madeleine's snarky tone and her expression irked Camille. Camille tilted her brow and looked at Madeleine with ambiguity. "Well," Madeleine laughed at her, "you don't want him standing beside you, declaring to keep himself only unto you while he reeks of me, do you?" She thought about backing out of the room. She thought about asking Madeleine to pass on a message, like that would happen. She thought about barging into Julian's bathroom. Camille opted for the latter. "Hey," Madeleine objected as Camille headed across the room. "You can't go in there." Camille stopped at the door, her hand resting on the knob, and glanced over her shoulder. She tried to stop it, tried not to stoop to Madeleine's level, but her pride interjected. "There's nothing in there that I haven't seen before." She didn't wait for Madeleine's response, just opened the door and hot steam rolled out. "Julian," she called out, entering and closing the door behind her.
"Chérie?"
Laughter chased his enduring term for her.
"Have you come to join me?"
God, what nerve. She wasn't about to take Madeleine's sloppy seconds. Not today. But it was nice to know Julian was so virile. At least he thought he was. And Julian wasn't the kind of guy to start something he wasn't certain he could finish. Camille thought about what he had told her about Madeleine making sure Camille caught them in bed. She wasn't sure if he meant that literally or figuratively, and she didn't have the courage to ask him. Whether or not Julian was sleeping with another woman wasn't any of her business. "Julian!" Camille stomped her foot on the tile. "My dress was not in the delivery from the designer in Paris." The water stopped.
"What?"
His hardened tone shredded the single-word inquiry. "My dress!" All her hopes for a trouble-free wedding were crushed in her diminishing, barely audible voice. "It's not here." By the time Julian opened the shower door, he had wrapped a towel around his waist. Her disappointment was overshadowed by the view of his torso. Rippling muscles engraved on his bronzed skin defined his manliness and nearly floored Camille. Julian grabbed his cell phone off the nearby counter and hit the speed dial. He waited for an answer on the other end, and Camille got caught up in the water droplets dangling off his wet hair. Finally, they dripped onto his shoulders and followed well-carved paths down his chest. She tried to fend off the overwhelming desire to grab a towel and dry him off with long, slow, sensuous strokes. He spouted words in French, pulling Camille out of her wishful thinking. She had no idea what he was saying, but by the tone of his voice, she'd say it wasn't good. He paused every so often, and with each gap, his ensuing tone softened. Finally, she thought he'd apologized just before he disconnected the call. That surprised Camille. It wasn't in Julian's makeup to administer apologies. He laid the phone on the counter and looked at Camille with sorrow shading his eyes.
"Marie insists the dress was in the delivery."
He spoke as if the words weighed heavy on his family's good name.
"It's disappeared since arriving here."
His face winced, and the frown set into his features. "Who would do such a thing?" Camille asked, even though she had a pretty good guess.
"I'll find your dress,"
he said, and stormed out. Camille followed him into his room. Surprise, surprise. Madeleine was gone, right along with Camille's dress. Chapter 11. Camille Chandler de Laurent had been the picture of grace and poise during a wedding disaster like no other. First, her dress had disappeared, but she had graciously gone to her closet and picked out a simple peach evening gown that Julian had bought her in London. Claudette's hairdresser had done an excellent job of fashioning Camille's hair on top of her head and leaving loose tresses framing her face and resting on her neckline. Between the dress and her hair, she reminded Julian of a goddess holding court on Mount Olympus, rather than a woman he should be fortunate enough to wed. Then the rain came. It destroyed her perfectly coiffured hair and drenched her designer gown, which would have shrunk several sizes had it not been forced to retain some of its shape by her womanly figure. At the reception, though, the dress had begun to dry and now brimmed several inches above her ankles. Julian hated that he hadn't been able to find Camille's dress. He'd failed his new wife, but he was determined to win her forgiveness. Why he felt this way, he didn't know. Their marriage was nothing more than a deal, and she was being well compensated for her share. Still, to those on the outside, it looked like a personal disaster for the bride, and that was unacceptable for Julian. Soren. Where is Soren? He would help Julian fix this, or at least make it seem less painful. With Soren's help, he'd find a way to ease Camille's embarrassment. Finally, Julian spotted Soren directing the servants in the makeshift kitchen. A crew specializing in weddings had turned the inside of a rented tent into a temporary haven of enchanted opulence. Camille sat in a stiffened pose, trying to appear as regal and confident as possible, but detesting every second of her time at a table in the center of the pavilion. She wasn't sure if she could pin the rain on Madeleine, unless the French had found a way to control the weather. If anybody could, Camille's money was on her new father-in-law. But the wedding gown? That mystery had Madeleine's name scribbled across it in big red letters. Julian and Soren, standing on the edge of the pavilion, caught her eye. The two men were in deep conversation, like two thieves plotting their next heist. What were they up to? Camille's curiosity soared and landed somewhere in the vicinity of tonight. Not that she expected to have a night of wedded bliss with Julian, but the thought of him sleeping with another woman on this night just didn't seem right. Even though they weren't consummating the marriage, somehow she thought tonight should be about them. Camille and Julian, not Julian and Madeleine. On the other side of the bride and groom's table, Andre and Tasha sat whispering into one another's ears. One of Andre's arms rested on the back of Tasha's chair, and he was caressing her upper arm with his free hand. She, in turn, had laid her hand on his chest and leaned in toward him as she whispered into his ear. Camille had told her not to do that. She didn't need Julian's dejected brother added to the mix. Keeping herself on the path of an unbroken heart was hard enough, especially now that the path had begun to narrow. And if she thought this day couldn't get any worse, right on cue, Madeleine invited herself to sit in Julian's chair. She looked at Camille and gave her one of those fake smiles that made you want to smack the girl across the face. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Camille asked, determined to keep a civil tongue. Madeleine frowned. "You poor dear." Her face skewed into a crooked smile, and she followed it with laughter. "How ridiculous you look! No wonder your husband is clear across the room." Camille played with the diamond-studded bands Julian had placed on her ring finger. Her way of pointing out something that Madeleine lacked. "I guess ridicule is in the eye of the beholder." Camille shrugged, well on her way to losing the fight with her pride. "How'd it feel to watch the man you want to marry wed someone else?"
Pretty much the same way it's going to feel when he stops coming to your bed at night, because he's wrapped up in mine."
Camille's throat tightened and she hesitated, fighting for control of her temper. 1,000 comebacks shuffled across her mind. If she didn't confront this challenge right away, the next 6 months would be hell.
"Fancy yourself a permanent room here at Pacifique de Lumiere, do you?"
Camille flashed her a look she hoped was bathed in mockery.
"You'd be surprised at how much influence a wife has over her husband where the mistress is concerned."
Madeleine's brittle laughter gave away her waning confidence, and she grabbed a glass of champagne off the tray of a passing waiter.
"Make no mistake, Madeleine,"
Camille said, her self-assurance continuing to swell.
"You and I will not be living in the same house."
She hadn't seen Julian approaching the table and was a bit startled when he leaned down between them, but spoke to Madeleine.
"I do hope you're not thinking of making a scene."
"Of course not, darling."
She trailed her fingertips longingly over his cheek.
"Your new bride and I were just setting some ground rules."
Julian turned to Camille and plastered on a smile.
"Will you excuse us for just a moment, chérie?"
He didn't wait for her answer. Instead, he latched onto Madeleine's arm and forced her from the chair. His expression gave no sign of tolerance, and Camille was certain Madeleine wasn't being guided willingly. Hopefully, Julian didn't want a scene any more than Camille, but he had to understand she wasn't about to put up with Madeleine's rudeness, not for any amount of money. Julian practically dragged Madeleine in front of him by the time they cleared the tent's entrance. Outside on the rain-drenched lawn, they stepped in a mud puddle. Madeleine scoffed and stomped her foot, splashing them both with dirty water. "How dare you!" She chastised him with one of those evil-eyed looks she was so famous for. "How dare you treat me like a casual and indifferent acquaintance?"
"Madeleine, you are a guest at my wedding."
He ripped out the words through gritted teeth.
"Not my choice, but you are here, so let's be civil and do me a favor,"
he asked, but didn't wait for her response.
"Stay away from my wife."
Not that Julian liked being hostile to Madeleine or any other woman, but he knew this one too well. Civility meant something more than its true purpose in her eyes. Thanks to his meddlesome father, Madeleine actually thought there was still a chance for some sort of relationship between them, and the last thing Julian wanted was Madeleine still hanging around with stars in her eyes after Camille had come and gone.
"Julian!"
Desperation invaded her voice and pushed her plea out.
"She cannot give you what you truly need. I'm the only one that can do that. You know I know what satisfies and pleases you."
Well, she had a point. Little did she know. Julian's wife had made it clear that he wasn't getting what he needed from her, but that wouldn't stop him from trying. The one thing he did know was there was no place for Madeleine in this scenario. But he wasn't about to confirm that to Camille. He thought he'd seen a hint of jealousy in her eyes more than once over Madeleine, and where there's jealousy, there was also a chance for seduction.
"Have some dignity, girl."
His less than friendly tone chilled the air around them.
"I chose someone else. Move on."
He hated the hurt in her eyes, but it was necessary. Necessary to keep her away when Camille left and Julian played the dutiful but abandoned husband. He neither needed nor wanted any comfort from Madeleine. Hopefully his treatment of her now would compel her to disregard him when the time came.
"You'll change your mind."
This was worse than he'd thought, and required drastic measures.
"Pack your things. I want you gone by the time I get back."
"Get back? Where are you going?"
"On my honeymoon."
She glared at him for a moment, like she had something else to say, but instead picked up the hem of her dress and trotted across the lawn toward the house. Good. Now that that's taken care of. Julian turned and faced his guests. Scanning the crowd, his bride was gone too. He checked his watch. Soren was probably on his way back by now. If he'd had trouble carrying out his mission, he would have called. A semblance of relief reassured Julian. At least something was going to go right today. He stepped back inside the tent's entrance just in time to see Papa swoop into Andre's empty chair and commandeer Tasha's attention. Julian didn't trust Papa, not entirely. Stealth mode was the best course of action. Julian walked around the perimeter of the tent and slipped in through the back entrance. He paused, unnoticed, behind a wall of flowers next to the bride and groom's table. The sweet scent of lavender overwhelmed him, but he didn't find it nearly as offensive as Madeleine's perfume.
"My dear, it was so nice of you to drop everything," Papa said, "and join us for Julien's wedding at the last minute."
Papa had left Camille's name out on purpose, but Julian had a feeling Papa's innuendos were going to be wasted on Tasha.
"Well,"
Tasha said in a serene voice,
"nothing's more important than my best friend's wedding."
Good. She's keeping the conversation amiable and neutral.
"I hope your boss doesn't feel so inconvenienced that it will affect your job."
Papa was fishing. Julian hoped Tasha didn't bite.
"Well, I do freelance work," she said politely. "And I'm between gigs right now, so there's no worries."
She's really good. It would serve Papa right if Andre did manage to steal her heart.
"You are a delightful girl, Tasha."
Maurice's tone took on an air of indulgence. That worried Julian. It was Papa's lure of choice when the fish weren't biting.
"Where, pray tell, did you and Camille meet?"
Her answer came after a split second of silence.
"Camille and I met in an acting class."
"Well now, you don't say."
Julian slid his hands in his pockets and emerged from behind the partition. So what if Papa found out Camille was an actress? Big deal. "Papa?" He eased up to the table and sat next to his father.
"You're not pestering this young lady, are you?"
he asked in an offhanded and joking manner, one he knew Papa would recognize for its hidden gravity. Julian was pretty sure the man had invented it himself.
"Me? Pester a lovely young lady?"
he asked, as if that was a ridiculous notion.
"Absolutely not."
He added his boisterous trademark laughter, knowing it intimidated most people. What Papa didn't know was that it hadn't intimidated Julian for quite some time. He had been waiting for the perfect moment and decided the time had come for his demands. Julian leaned closer to his father.
"When I return from my honeymoon,"
his soft, whispering tone tangled with the hardened stare he was caught up in with Papa. Julian didn't blink.
"I want Madeleine out of the house. Boy, don't presume to tell me what or who to invite into my home."
Maurice kept his voice low but stern.
"Either she goes or Camille and I will move into town."
Julian played his hand, but it wasn't a bluff. He was prepared to move out of Pacifique de Lumière because the only thing Maurice de Laurent hated more than being told what to do was being abandoned by his family. Julian smirked and leaned back into his chair.
"I do believe Claudette is looking for you."
Papa's head crooked around, as if in spy mode, searching for his wife. Julian leaned closer before Papa had the chance to escape.
"You wouldn't know what happened to my wife's dress, would you?"
Papa looked stunned.
"You think I had something to do with that?"
Julian studied his face.
"In a word, yes. I wouldn't put it past you." "Julien, I swear to you,"
he said, raising a hand in the air as if giving an oath,
"I had nothing to do with the disappearance of that wedding gown. Claudette would have my head."
That was true. Claudette didn't mess around when it came to fashion, and high-priced fashion at that. Julian doubted Papa would risk the doghouse just to upset Camille. No, this had to be Madeleine's doing. Camille appeared in his peripheral vision, headed toward him, still wearing the same length shrinking dress. She'd let her hair down, and he found the look, although a bit on the wild side, just as pleasing as before the rain. The perfect picture of grace, she greeted their guests with polite smiles and gestures as she passed them by. Julian swelled with pride. He stood, pulled her chair out, and waited. She smiled as she sat, and something in her manner soothed him. "I wondered where you'd gone off to," he said, returning to his seat.
"Just freshening up a bit."
She surveyed the crowd around them with a quick glance.
"So, what's on the agenda for this evening?"
She settled her gaze on Julian.
"We do need to talk."
He chuckled.
"We'll have plenty of time to talk about whatever your heart desires. There's going to be nobody but you and me for the next 10 days. Well, you, me, and a small crew."
Camille studied his face, no doubt trying to figure out the mystery surrounding his elusive clue. But he wasn't telling.
"Am I going to regret this?"
Julian pretended to consider it.
"No,"
he said, shaking his head.
"I can pretty much guarantee you're going to love it."
He smiled and winked.
"Full of yourself, aren't you?"
she asked, half serious, half teasing.
"I'm getting to you."
Julian caught her gaze and trapped her there.
"Not as much as you want to."
"Are you ready?"
"For?"
"To, how do you Americans say?"
He paused and searched his mind for the correct phrase.
"Blow this pop stand?"
Camille giggled.
"That's so 1990s.
She looked at the bridal bouquet on the table.
"But I haven't tossed my bouquet away yet."
"You're really going to throw that away?"
He didn't understand the concept. Women were extremely sentimental, and giving their bridal bouquet away made absolutely no sense.
"Well, this is not the one I carried down the aisle. It's a replacement to use specifically for tossing the bouquet."
She reached for the flowers and cut her eyes toward Andre and Tasha. Julian stole a look across the table. His brother was making a spectacle of himself. Julian managed to contain his amusement and kept the laughter to just a thought. He scooped up a handful of miniature mints in a nearby bowl and tossed them at Andre, tearing him away from Tasha. Julian's laughter escaped. Andre glared at Julian and mouthed the word, "What?"
"You're on, little brother," Julian said. "Gather all the single girls around."
A smile spread across Andre's face.
"I can do that."
He stood and scooted Tasha up to the dance floor. Once Andre had gathered a slew of single girls around Tasha, Julian reached for Camille's hand and led her to the stage in front of the dance floor. He turned her back to the crowd and winked, saying,
"No peeking."
"You're incorrigible."
"Don't tell anyone,"
Julian said, as Andre hopped up onto the stage.
Ladies, gather around,"
Andre coaxed with waving hands.
"It's that time. Who's going to be next?"
"Andre, we want to see you front and center when Julian tosses the gator."
An unidentifiable feminine voice came out of the crowd. In spite of himself, Julian chuckled at Andre, trying to charm his way out of this one. Andre landed his hand against his chest and followed it with a defining headshake. Baby brother was not interested in being next. Andre turned his focus on Camille.
"Okay, on the count of 3.
He paused and draped his hand over the microphone.
"Just toss it over your shoulder. They'll do the rest."
Julian moved closer to Camille, targeting her ear.
€10 says he'll use this bouquet-throwing incident to seduce the woman who catches it.
Camille looked at Andre.
€10? Is that a lot?
Andre's laughter had a bite to it.
"Okay, ladies, here we go."
He cajoled Camille with a gentle nudge.
1, 2, 3. She tossed the bouquet back over her head, and it sailed into the cluster of single women. The flowers bounced around as if on a springboard, rebounding off Tasha's head and sailing behind her into Lassie's hands, where it stayed. Oh, Papa wasn't going to like this. Julian snickered inside. At least she was safe from Andre's charms. Okay, bud. Camille hit his arm and waggled her hands. Cough it up. 10 euros. Pay up. One of the groomsmen passed a chair up to the stage. Andre directed Camille to sit. She glanced anxiously between Julian and his brother. Julian flashed her an assuring smile and leaned in toward her ear. No worries, Sherry. I'm just going to tastefully remove your garter and toss it out into a group of uninteresting and undeserving members of the male sex. He kissed her cheek, and she giggled as Julian dropped to the floor on one knee. He's already been there! Another nameless female yelled out, and all the other women howled. Julian bowed his head and smiled at the mob, and that induced them to cheer louder. He slid his hands beneath Camille's dress and ran them slowly up her smooth, bare leg. The gentleman in him stopped when he found the garter. Remember, Andre said to Julian, this is a G-rated show. I know that. Julian huffed under his breath. Did Andre think him a cad? He thought he deserved a bit more credit. Julian slid the garter down Camille's leg and over her foot. He swung it around his extended forefinger like a hula hoop. When the crowd neared a frenzied state, Julian whipped it into the air like a prize. The wedding guests cheered with catcalls and profane words in French. Julian slipped his hand around Camille's. He scanned over the crowd to see who had caught the garter, but came up with nothing. He wouldn't care much, except that Lassie had caught the bouquet and these two people were supposed to dance. He leaned toward Andre. Who caught that? Stefan Payet. You tell that little shit to keep his hands off Lassie, Julian ordered, trying to contain his ferocity and hint at it at the same time. He turned to Camille and she softened his mood. Are you ready? She raised her chin with a cool stare in his direction. Trust me, he said. She looked at him like she'd already done that, and look where it had gotten her. Julian winked at her and squeezed her hand. Yeah, okay. Her expression of doubt changed to desire. Julian winked at her again, his confidence growing. He tore his attention away from Camille and turned to their guests. As much fun as this party is, he laughed comically. My wife and I must bid you adieu. Julian hopped off the stage and swept Camille into his arms. He kept her there as he made his way through the crowd and to the limo waiting just outside the tent's main entrance. Soren was waiting by the car. Good. He was back. That meant he'd completed his task. Julian set Camille on her feet and Soren opened the car door. She slid inside and Julian leaned against the open door, motioning for Soren to come closer. He inched toward Julian. Did you take care of it? Julian asked. Yes, sir. It's in the safe on the boat. Soren folded his hands behind his back, and a smile spread over his face. She will be pleased, sir. Good. Julian slapped him on the arm and slipped inside the car. Have a good trip, sir, Soren said, closing the door. While Julian and Camille were honeymooning, Soren was taking his own much-deserved vacation. He'd earned it with his flawless loyalty. Julian turned to Camille and draped his arm along the back of the seat. Are you going to tell me where we're going now? She asked, intrigued. No. Julian grinned. She sighed and smacked him on the knee. Why not? It's a surprise. Julian reached for the champagne bottle resting in the bin of ice. He snagged 2 glasses hidden inside a nearby compartment, steadied them between the fingers of one hand, and filled them with the bubbly.
He returned the bottle back to the ice and handed her a glass. Suspicion held her gaze on him a little longer than necessary. She laced her fingers around the flute's stem, still looking at him. After a moment, she closed her eyes and sipped the champagne. Julian took the opportunity to gaze at her while she wasn't looking and tried to evaluate her unreadable features. Failing miserably, he was somehow comforted by her nearness. Her eyes opened slowly and focused on him.
"So, why won't you tell me where we're going?"
she asked again, more persistent this time.
"Already told you."
He shook his head.
"It's a surprise."
"Well, how long will we be gone?"
"About 10 days."
10 days?
She echoed.
"Are we going on a honeymoon?"
"Such as it is."
He couldn't sound too eager. Women never found eagerness from a man appealing.
"We have an image to uphold, Sherry."
"Yeah."
The single word trailed off into a long, low sigh, and the smile on her face faded. She was probably getting tired of all the drama. He couldn't blame her after the day they'd had. With any luck, he'd change all that with a short trip to the marina. If not, it was going to be a long, lonely 10 days. Chapter 12. Camille couldn't get a break. The rain had returned in another torrential downpour by the time the limo arrived at the marina. Curiosity over why they had come here engulfed her, but she didn't dwell on it. She tried to peer out the car's windows, but sheets of rain distorted her view. All she could make out was blurred structures that she decided were luxury yachts.
"We'll wait a few moments for the rain to subside,"
Julian said, the car rolling up beside a massive ship.
"Then what?"
Camille asked. She'd learned a long time ago not to make assumptions.
"Then we're going to get on the boat."
Boat? She tried to hide her enthusiasm behind a stoic expression and wasn't sure if she'd succeeded. Julian leaned toward her. She wished he wouldn't do that. Being this close to him was too tempting. Resisting his charms for the next 6 months might prove harder than she'd anticipated.
"Yes, the Neoma Luis,"
he said in a broken whisper.
"Well, that sure clears it up."
She giggled, more at herself than anything else. She glanced out the window. The rain was still pouring.
"Is it that one right there?"
she asked, pointing to the blur they'd parked beside.
"Yes, that's the Neoma Luis."
"The Neoma Luis?"
She stared unseeing at the distorted figure.
"Does the name hold some significance?"
"My mother's name."
A faint flicker of sadness rattled through her, shaking her shoulders.
"Are you cold, Sherry?"
he asked attentively.
"Not in the least,"
Camille said, wagging her head. She glanced at her dress. It's not like it could get ruined any more than it already had. And besides, the huge blur looked a lot bigger than the car she and Julian were caged in. She could get with putting some distance between them and maybe a dry change of clothing.
"What the hell?"
She shrugged and perched her hands in the air. "Let's go for it." She latched onto the door handle. He looked at her with surprise and intrigue.
"Now? In the rain?"
"Come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" They'd already gotten soaked once today. What could one more time hurt?
"All right."
He finally came around.
"But wait here. I'll open your door."
What a gentleman. She chuckled inside, pleased. Julian opened his door and slipped out into the rainy night. Seconds later, the car door opened and a blast of cool rain bulleted Camille in the inside of the limo. She shielded her face with one hand and took Julian's with the other, climbing out onto the wet pavement and venturing into the storm. They ran, and she wished she had taken off her shoes, afraid she'd slip on the slick surface. Julian guided her aboard the ship and into the lounge on the main deck. He shut the door between them and the rain, and Camille released the breath she'd been holding. They both dragged their soaked hair out of their faces and let their laughter fill the room.
"What do you say we get out of these wet clothes?" she asked, and immediately saw the desire to throw out some derisive comeback in his smile. "Into something warm and dry, I mean," she added, not wanting it to sound like a desperate come-on.
Julian rested his hand on the small of her back.
"Our stateroom is this way."
Stateroom. As in single. Just one. Camille's body vibrated with new life. Consumed with rivaling sensations of anticipation and alarm, she was easily led toward an inside corridor. At the end of the hall, Julian opened the door to the ship's master suite. The room's size equaled that of Camille's L.A. apartment, but that was the only thing the two spaces had in common. The maple paneling was trimmed in beech and walnut veneers, and soft lighting gave the room a warm and pleasant atmosphere.
"You'll find clothes in the dressing room attached to the bath."
Julian gestured toward a door on the other side of the room. The sand-colored marble bathroom bathed her in warmth and tranquility. Mesmerized by the room's sleek sheen, Camille shut the door between herself and Julian.
"Sherry?"
His voice mingled with a soft tap at the door.
"I'm going back out into the main lounge. Please join me when you're ready."
"All right,"
she said, loud enough for her voice to filter through the walls. She hesitated and looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was beyond help, having been drenched twice today. Her makeup had gone blotchy, some aspects withstanding the rain's wrath better than others. All her toiletries had been laid out on the counter and placed in the drawers for her convenience. Everything had been prearranged, down to the last detail. She'd bet her clothes had already been unpacked and put away in the huge walk-in closet. What she hadn't expected to find was comfy sweats and oversized T-shirts. A smile spread from her heart to her face. Julian had remembered her chosen attire for relaxation. Were Julian and his staff going to cater to her every need and desire for the next 6 months? This was the life. But a life that she couldn't let herself get used to because it wasn't hers. She was not a permanent fixture in this lap of luxury. Still, there was no rule that said she couldn't enjoy it while it lasted, and that's exactly what Camille planned on doing. She scrubbed the half-worn makeup off her face and applied a light layer of loose powder to get rid of the shine. Instead of going for lipstick, she opted for a splash of flavored lip balm, more for its moisture content than anything else. She hated dry, chapped lips. The damp dress's spaghetti straps slipped easily off her shoulders, and she wiggled out of the gown and let it fall to the floor. She scooped it up and hung it on an empty hook next to a pair of plush bathrobes and a couple that looked like they were made of silk. There was a small bottle of perfume on the counter, and intrigue pushed her to examine it. The name was in French, and she had trouble reading it, but she thought it had something to do with flowers, or maybe the sun. She couldn't tell. She pressed the gold-tipped sprayer into the air and sniffed. The scent reminded her of orange blossoms. Camille shrugged and sprayed it over her naked body. She thought about dressing in a pair of sweats and a T-shirt, but grabbed the robe instead. It is silk, she thought, wrapping herself in the soft luxury, enjoying the feel against her bare skin. She went back to the bedroom and paused a moment. Did the robe make her look promiscuous? Who cares? She pushed the uneasiness aside and opened the door. Julian was her husband, and they needed to at least look like they were intimate, especially to the staff, whom she had no doubt were reporting back to Maurice. The red silk clung to her skin as she strolled through the hallway and out into the ship's main lounge. A taupe couch hugged the far wall and rounded both corners, covering half the room's perimeter. Dozens of pillows, the colors of creamy butter, crimson, and a pale green, had been placed on the couch to provide guests with added comfort. Artwork hung on the walls above the couch, and artifacts, probably priceless ones, were displayed strategically around the room. Everything had a feminine touch to it. Claudette was better than most interior decorators. Julian was sitting on a stool at the bar, nestled in the corner, wearing nothing but a pair of sweats. The black fleece hugged his waist. The color didn't distract from the chiseled muscles rippling underneath his bronzed skin. His ebony curls, still damp from the rain, glistened against the soft lights illuminating the wet bar. Camille surveyed the room one more time. The couch's center had a direct line to his stool and seemed like the best vantage point. She dropped to the sofa and covered a large portion with her long legs, crossing one over the other. Glancing up, she saw Julian staring at her. Anxiety pounded her heart against her chest. Nobody had ever looked at her like that. Thunder roared and vibrated through the boat and shook Camille's composure. She jumped up and charged toward the window, analyzing the rough seas. Hopefully they weren't going to set sail in this mess. She sucked in a deep breath and turned to Julian, pointing out the window. "We aren't going out in this weather, are we?"
"No."
He shook his head.
"We'll wait until the storm clears. Probably tomorrow."
He drained his glass and poured another.
"Can I get you a drink? Dinner is about half an hour away."
"Sure." She folded her arms in front of her and turned back to the window, mesmerized by the storm's ferocity. Camille had a feeling she was going to need a drink. Lots of them. Between the boat thing, she'd never learned to swim, and a creeping desire for Julian, her husband in name only, she was going to need all the help she could collect. Julian rose and strolled behind the bar. He had anticipated her need for a drink and put some champagne on ice as soon as he had changed out of his wet clothing. His competitive nature enjoyed it when his hunches proved right. Camille clutched her hands behind her back, fidgeting. Julian suspected the missing dress was to blame. It wouldn't surprise him. He couldn't censure her for thinking twice after what happened with her wedding gown and then the weather. She'd graciously and valiantly gone through with the ceremony, wet hair and all, in one of the outfits he had bought her earlier in the week. Julian still believed Madeleine had something to do with the missing garment. It made Madeleine look like a fool, and a hopeless one at that. Imagine thinking a missing dress would stop the wedding. Thankfully, it was just a business arrangement, and while Camille had expressed disappointment over not getting the chance to wear the dress, she had gladly and graciously agreed that any outfit would suffice. He grabbed a couple of glasses from the rack, sat them on the counter, and reached for the bottle of chilled champagne. As soon as he figured out what Madeleine had done with the dress, he was going to retrieve it and give it to Camille as a gift, so she could wear it when she was ready for a bona fide marriage. And Andre thought Julian was selfish. Shows how much he knows. Lightning flashed, casting a brief but welcomed glimpse of her beauty. Curves outlined her shapely figure beneath her silk robe as she approached the bar and hopped onto a stool. Loose tendrils of still damp blonde hair softened and framed her flawlessly stunning face. Julian poured champagne and handed her a glass.
"You were a great sport today, wearing a replacement gown at the ceremony."
She wrapped her fingers around the flute's stem. Well, it's not like it was that important. She sipped the champagne. Omens don't count for arranged marriages. She smiled girlishly, and the sight of it swept through Julian, leaving him wanting to kiss her.
"Omens?"
He moved around the bar and sat on the stool beside her. Well, if we were getting married for real, I would have called it a sign.
Maybe it's still a sign.
Nah, it doesn't work like that.
Then how does it work?
It's only a bad sign if we were actually in love.
Who says signs have to be bad?
A missing dress is bad. She slipped off the bar stool and moved to her original position on the couch.
I can see why you'd think that.
He followed her, draining his glass. His empty champagne flute clinked as it made contact with the marble-top coffee table. Julian sat, leaving little space between himself and Camille, leaned back and looked at her. It's a shame a woman such as her, with all her beauty, wit, and charm, couldn't have a real wedding night to go with the very legal ceremony. What do you think happened to the dress? Camille's soft, sweet voice invaded his happy thoughts. He'd give her 3 guesses, and the first 2 didn't count. In a word, Madeleine. But without proof, Julian wasn't comfortable making accusations.
I could only guess, Sherry.
Yeah, and your first 2 don't count.
What the hell?
A manic, crazed feeling slammed Julian's heart to the floor. He swallowed the panic and lugged his heart up into his chest.
When we return to Marseille,
he said, commanding himself to relax,
I will find out what happened to your dress.
Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. She shrugged, disappointed. It's not like there was really anything to spoil by stealing it. Her words left no guessing on the matter. She suspected, just as Julian did, that someone, probably Madeleine, had stolen the dress.
But the dress is yours, Sherry,
he said, stretching his arm along the back of the sofa.
No matter the circumstances, the dress was made for you. It belongs to you.
She smiled and seemed to soften, melting into a display of agreeability. You're an awfully nice guy, Julian. A tremor touched her lips. No wonder Madeleine's blowing a gasket. Julian laughed, partly because the last thing he ever wanted to be thought of was a nice guy, but mostly because he found her American point of view hilarious. Blowing a gasket. How amusing. An attendant appeared in the doorway next to the wet bar. He waited until Julian acknowledged him with a slight nod.
Good evening, sir,
he said.
Will you and Madame de Laurent be dining in here, or do you prefer one of the dining areas?
Julian looked at Camille. She shrugged, a clueless look shaping on her face. He thought about a romantic candlelit dinner up on deck overlooking the sea, but it was still raining. Eating in here in the lounge was out of the question. He didn't have many memories of his mother, but one of the few he had was about this place. She had never allowed food in this room, beyond hors d'oeuvres.
The dining room,
he said. An hour later, Julian and Camille were finishing dessert dishes of chocolate mousse and fresh strawberries. He reached for his glass of wine, needing to sate the fires ignited while he had gazed upon Camille in the candlelight. Her crystal eyes sparkled in the flame's glow. Her mouth was inviting and begged to be kissed. Long, slow, and hard. Moaning desire charged up Julian's throat. He disguised it by clearing it out in a regimented cough. Camille looked agitated. How was he going to get her to relax? What had her so wound up? Surely the dress wasn't an issue still. Granted, he saw how the whole missing dress episode could be unsettling, but he and Camille weren't actually committed to one another. It wasn't like it was a real omen. She had pointed that out. Maybe it was all for show. A real bride would be devastated. And Camille was, after all, an actress. But he couldn't help thinking there was something more to her anxiety. She'd been fiddling with her silverware, cutting, poking, and stirring the food on her plate all through dinner and dessert. Finally, she laid the fork down, the prongs resting on the edge of the dish, and raised her gaze to meet his. We need to talk. She rested her wrists against the edge of the table and rubbed her thumb against her forefinger.
Ah, perhaps I'm about to find out what's gotten her so upset.
Julian sighed. If he knew what was bothering her, he could fix it. There was always a way to fix a woman's disappointment. You just had to know how to go about it, and Julian was an expert in that department.
What's on your mind?
He asked, opening the door to any possibility.
Look, I know where you and I stand on our marriage, she said provisionally. But you yourself have said, more than once, that you want it to appear real.
That notion aroused old anxieties.
To everyone, including my family, our marriage must appear authentic.
Obviously, she was worried about that, and he needed to know why.
You think someone may not believe our authenticity?
Well,
she hesitated and shifted uneasily.
Some may doubt our sincerity, especially with your booty call hanging around.
Booty call?
She raked her fingers nervously through her hair.
I mean, I know it's none of my business and all, but it's kind of hard to expect people to believe our marriage is real if there are noticeable indicators suggesting otherwise.
Somewhere in her rambling, she had a point. Madeleine was the whole reason for this USAT's marriage. That amplified Camille's point. But Julian had already realized that, which is why he had taken steps at the reception to neutralize the awkward and problematic concerns. To Julian's surprise, Camille was also coming across as a bit jealous of Madeleine, and he knew there was nothing quite so tempting as a man who was wanted by another woman, especially when there was no love lost between the women. He was pretty sure Camille didn't think much of Madeleine.
I can see your point.
He leaned back in his chair and fed her his practiced, captivating grin, the one that charmed the ladies out of their good graces.
It's probably not a good idea to let a seemingly harmless idiosyncrasy poke holes in our otherwise perfect plan, huh?
Then you really need to get Madeleine in check.
Smart girl. She was getting rid of the thorn in her side and doing it diplomatically. Who could argue with the case she'd made?
I've already taken care of that.
It was best to let her know she had triumphed over Madeleine. He was counting on it winning him points.
Either she's gone by the time you and I return, or we will be moving into town.
Just as he suspected, a victorious smile spread over her face.
Really?
You find that hard to believe?
Well, yeah, kind of.
Why?
He hadn't shown Madeleine any sort of particular favor since he and Camille had returned from America. Perhaps it had something to do with Madeleine being a guest at the house.
Well, you know.
Her words drifted into a hushed whisper, and she looked away shyly. Julian laid his hand on the table, regretting they were so far apart that he couldn't touch her.
Sherry?
Look, I know it's really none of my business who or what you do.
Her tone was lit with a possessive desperation.
But since you're the one who wants it to look real, you probably should use a bit more discretion in your dalliances with Madeleine.
She looked almost embarrassed. Julian laughed. Camille thought he was carrying on a running affair with Madeleine. And she was jealous. Huh! Imagine that.
Did she tell you we were,
Or maybe she didn't like having it thrown in her face.
Yes,
Camille nodded,
in graphic detail.
No wonder she was angry.
Sherry, have you forgotten?
He paused and managed to contain his laughter to just a thought.
Madeleine is the reason I married you.
A look of torment crossed her face.
I just don't get that.
She paused, waving a gesture into the air.
Why didn't you just marry her? In your room this morning, she made it clear you'll be continuing your affair.
What are you talking about?
He tried to hide his confusion, but it escaped in his coolly disapproving tone.
She was in your room this morning.
No, she wasn't.
Yes, she was.
When?
There was no way Madeleine was in his room, and he didn't understand why Camille thought otherwise.
Oh, she was there. You were in the shower. He shook his head, hardly able to believe Madeleine's nerve.
She must have come in when I got in the shower.
Of course. Camille closed her eyes and seemed to be letting reality sink in. You said she'd do this. She shook her head in a slow, rhythmic movement and looked at Julian. I feel like an idiot, she said, almost laughing at herself. She insinuated she'd been there all night. A sense of sadness hung a long, brittle silence in the air. He shook his head regretfully.
She's crazy. She was no more in my room last night than I was in yours.
You did say she'd set out to have me catch the two of you in bed together, Camille said. I just didn't realize it would all be a charade. He felt bad now that Madeleine, who thought the marriage was authentic, had thrown a faux affair in his wife's face.
Cherie, I'm so sorry.
He closed his eyes for a second or two and then looked back at Camille.
Even in a business arrangement, you didn't deserve to be humiliated.
Her cheeks reddened a tinge. He could see it, even in the dimly lit candle's glow. Should he make his move? Or should he bid her good night and let her contemplate all she'd learned? He had to be very careful. Moving too quickly could ruin his chances forever.